Hello, my friends. Today we are going to talk about backstory, what it is, and how to use it in your book. We've talked about this a little bit when we jumped into the timeline and where your book should start. At what specific point does your story start, even though there might be some things that happen before it that is relevant. And what that is really backstory. Essentially, backstory is all the things that happened before the start of your book. And for the purposes of our discussion today, let's assume that you're starting your book sometime, let's just say like around age 20, right? So there might be 20 years of backstory that's relevant to what you're writing about. There may be only a few things, a few memories, a few bits of information in your backstory that's relevant to your story. But backstory does have a very important role in your book. It also can be quite tempting to include too much. So I want to talk about it today to level set and make sure that you have a good understanding of what it is and how to incorporate it and know when to possibly cut it. So it's essentially all the things that happen before the start of your book. That doesn't mean all of that needs to be incorporated in your story, but you have all of that available to use if needed. Backstory is told as a narrative, as part of your narrative, so it's not, it doesn't necessarily need to be in a scene, right? Like a flashback, and we're going to talk about this in another video. A flashback is a scene. You're describing a particular moment, but backstory is like kind of filling us in. What happened earlier in your life? How did you get from, what happened before you got to where you are at right now in the current moment in your story? And of course, backstory applies to not just the beginning, but your entire story. For example, you might be talking about a moment or the time you picked up gardening, something like that. Part of your backstory in that scene in your book would be taking us back maybe to the time where you spent a summer at your grandma's house and she was a huge gardener and you fell in love with it then. So we would get to know a little bit about something or a little bit more about you. You were exposed to gardening at a young age. You liked it back then, but you didn't pick it up until later in life. Maybe those things are relevant. We get to know that you had a relationship with your grandma, and she might be a big role in your book. If not, maybe that backstory bit isn't as relevant, and you can kind of mention it and move on or not mention it at all. Another use for backstory is to really richen your characters. I'm going to call them characters. The people in your book are characters for all intents and purposes here. For example, if you have your mother in your book, you're going to give us some backstory about how you interacted with her maybe at a younger age, and we're going to get to know her that way. What backstory is not just like an information dump. So we don't need like a full chapter of Danielle 101, like where Danielle came from. She was born on this day and her mother was this person and she came from, like, it's not a biography here. Backstory is not supposed to be dumped at the beginning. There may be backstory that belongs in the beginning of a story. For example, your chapter might start at this kind of pivotal moment. Something major just happened, and you describe the scene you're in, and you describe your emotions, and you describe what's going on and what's happening around you, and all your readers are kind of like, okay, cool, something's happening here, what's going on, and what led to this? Our mind is already starting to ask these questions. So then you take us back. This whole thing started a week ago. Backstory is kind of like fuel for what is going on in your book. For example, if I write about a book, if I write a book about how I became a single mother, right? I'm going to probably start it at some point where I'm at, I am a mother, I am a single mother, I have had one or more of my children by that point in the beginning of my story. But then I can take you back to maybe when my first son was born and all the things that led up even to that and how I even became single, right? Like some of those things are going to be relevant in a story about single motherhood. We don't necessarily start, the moment that I meet my son's father, so That's like not part of the story in a direct narrative scene, thematic way, if you will. So we are going to use backstory to kind of fill those gaps, richen the characters, deepen our information about them and what we know about them, and it's more than just giving us those stats on these people. So there's no rule of thumb. Your book doesn't have to have a whole ton of backstory or just like a few blips here and there. It's going to depend on your story, obviously, but it's also going to depend on whether you have a lot in your history that supports your current narrative. So again, maybe your book is on something and you kind of started at the beginning of that something, and there's not a ton before it that really motivated you or drove you to that point. But there might be things that we need to know about you, where you come from or your family, and why you are the way you are, or why your mom is acting like that. Those bits are going to be woven in very naturally at the point that we need to learn about them. If you tell us about your mom being stubborn in chapter 1, but we don't even meet her in a scene, and until chapter 5, chances are we're not going to remember, like, oh yeah, she's the stubborn mom. We would want to learn about her when we meet her, when she's in the scene, when things are happening. So ask yourself, is this information needed? Do the readers know enough about this character, or is there something in that backstory that I can give them? Is this too much? Is it feeling too bulky? Am I just going off on a tangent? That's when you know your backstory is just like, that's a big problem for a lot of writers. They want to give you as much information as possible, but really being able to hone it in and focus only on what's important at that time. We can learn about that other stuff if needed later or before that scene, but we don't need it all at once, all in one bite. Think of this as just kind of feeding them little bits here and there as they need it. They meaning the readers here. So backstory, again, is very important. It keeps us kind of curious. We're like, we want to know more about you. We want to get to know your character. Backstory has to happen. You can't just info dump on us and just start, telling us everything within the current narrative, but make sure you are questioning, is it too much? Is it enough? And is it in the right place? Those are kind of the keys there with backstory. So keep that in mind. And remember your timeline. Backstory happens before the beginning of your story. Backstory is not on your story arc. Backstory is not on your story arc. That's kind of the key. It's another clue to help you with your story arc if you're struggling with that as well. Does this stuff belong in the past? Going back to my single mother book, I might start at the moment I got divorced, officially a single mom. And then I might, hey, I never imagined motherhood like this. When I met my husband, I envisioned, we'd have babies and live together forever and ever, happily ever after the end. I might then at that point take you back, back to how I met him and how we had the babies and all that, right? But my story might start at that moment when I walk out of the courtroom and I'm a free woman. So that's where my story arc, that's point 1 on my story arc. And then I start traveling up and down, Cinderella's pathway there. But everything that happened before then is not even seen on my story arc. If it's helpful, dive into your backstory, write out the backstory. A lot of fiction writers spend a lot of time on backstory, filling out who these characters are and what is important to know about them, and really deepening their personalities and their characteristics so that when they're writing, it's coming across on the page. You know yourself, you know who's in your life, but your readers don't. So you have to make sure that backstory comes into play when it's needed to make your book that thing that your readers are really connecting with, and they're just driven forward with their curiosity to learn more and more and more. So that is backstory. It is different than a flashback. So we are going to talk about that in another video. So stay tuned, probably tomorrow. So come back and we'll learn more and you can keep writing. This is going to be great. We'll see you soon.